I'm not necessarily expecting any sort of explosive recovery anytime soon, but I do think that any interested people might want to look into the space because I think this is a time to consider start laying capital in, or to start maybe building up a position, or at least studying it to see if it's something you eventually want to go into. I'm pretty optimistic long term on where we are now, while still cautioning that the next 3 to 6 months, anything can really go. When last 10,000 move was somewhat surprising to me. I think that was below
Mm,
my base case. I would not have been surprised to see us go below 30. I think going below 20 what was a deeper capitulation than I would have guessed several months ago. For people who've been following my work, generally, Bitcoin and cryptos do well in rising PMI environments. So Purchasing Managers Index, economic acceleration, they usually do well in that kind of environment. And then they usually do poorly or sideways in declining PMI environments, economic contraction type of environments. And those are generally these like 3-year cycles that the global economy goes through, US economy, global economy. And so, I had been getting cautious in the tactical sense about the fact that we were going through a declining PMI environment, and then therefore that can put a lot of pressures on Bitcoin, despite the fact that I would say still structurally long-term bullish on it, but then being aware of that kind of downside. And then in particular when Luna started buying Bitcoin, so Luna Foundation Guard, um, I started to kind of write about a potential scenario where they told implode and they end up having to sell their Bitcoin into a weak market capitulation, and that's unfortunately what we saw in May. Now, the deeper leg that I didn't necessarily expect was the implosion of 3 Hours Capital. So basically, there's more contagion in the space. There's really
yeah.
kind of a follow-on. It was kind of the second part of that Luna collapse, right? So for example, there's a proprietary trading company, 3 Hours Capital, that they had over 10 billion in capital at their peak, and they were heavily impaired by the Luna implosion. They also had leverage out from multiple different shops. It's pretty opaque leverage, and they use Bitcoin as collateral mostly to trade altcoins. And so they're not like making leverage bets on Bitcoin, but they're using Bitcoin as collateral to go out and buy other things. And they basically just ran into massive issues and got liquidated. And so there's all this kind of forced selling of Bitcoin, total capitulation in cryptos. A number of companies went bankrupt or near bankrupt, had all sorts of liquidity crises. You have a lot of entities that are busy forced selling. And so this is the one, Luna was something that I wrote about and expected and cautioned about, where something more opaque like 3 Hours Capital is kind of the second leg to that. That one's harder to predict. And so I think the environment we're in now is that we've had a pretty deep capitulation. It's always hard to say if you're at the ultimate bottom or not, but this does look a lot like the late 2018 capitulation where Bitcoin, for a while, Bitcoin was kind of stabilizing around 6,000, and then it just out of nowhere got cut in half, down to almost 3,000 when you had the Fed tightening and you had, problems in credit markets and you had this kind of contagion. And so I think that we've gone through a similar capitulation now where Bitcoin looked like it was trying to bottom around 30,000, it was kind of that level environment, and then out of nowhere it got just completely capitulated down to sub 20,000. So by most metrics, it's in a pretty deep value zone, right? So it's below the average on-chain cost
Yes.
basis. It touched below the 200-week moving average, which it almost never does. Basically, we've had a lot of forced selling. I mean, generally, you want to be a buyer during forced selling and a trimmer when everyone's
Mm,
euphoric. So I think
mhm.
that if I were to look back 3 to 5 years from now, I would not be surprised. I'd be mostly confident this is probably going to look at a pretty significant buying opportunity in Bitcoin. But I do think that people have to be aware that it might not be over. There could be more pain ahead. I think the macro situation is still kind of going to be struggling for a number of months here, and so I'm not necessarily expecting any sort of explosive recovery anytime soon. But I do think that any interested people might want to look into the space because I think this is a time to consider start laying capital in, or to start maybe building up a position, or at least studying it to see if it's something you eventually want to go into because I first bought Bitcoin during the it was April 2020, so we were just coming out of
Yes.
that whole COVID crash, and that was the last time, that was the fourth time ever that Bitcoin was below its on-chain cost basis, um,
Yes.
and now it's the fifth time, and so in many ways it looks like that earlier type of environment, and so I'm I'm pretty optimistic long term on where we are now, while still cautioning that the next 3 to 6 months, anything can really go when you're in this type of weak economic environment.
To the interview.
Bitcoin had less of a blow off top in this cycle. Most of the blow off
Mm.
top was in other things like Dogecoin or some of
Yeah.
these like either meme coins or some of the smart contract platforms. Bitcoin itself had more of a rolling top, so I was kind of as a base case maybe expecting it not to capitulate as much as it did in some of its prior cycles.
Mhm.
That was before the whole 3 hours capital implosion. It was kind of the second leg of that divestiture. So basically, given how low sentiment was, and given what was happening with inflation in a number of markets, I was kind of expecting that upper 20s position might hold.
Mhm.
Um, I was, the way I was analyzing with my client was saying that I think this is a reasonable value zone. It's not a deep value zone. It's not a capitulation. And I kind of kept looking back at that 2018 chart and being like, this, you could have a pretty violent. So I wasn't ruling out this kind of final capitulation type of phase,
Yeah.
but wasn't necessarily expecting it either. But now that we've gotten it, I am kind of more confident than I was a number of months ago about kind of recommending that people at least consider looking into layering in or researching the protocol just to see if it's something that they're interested in. Basically, I think that now we have a pretty severe washout in terms of liquidated leverage, forced sellers. This is the time where I don't mind, picking some up and kind of being on the other side of that trade. So I think the next, like, say, 0 to 12 months is still very difficult to call because I think we're
Mhm.
we're currently still in an economic decelerating environment.
Yeah.
Now, historically, Bitcoin tends to bottom before PMI bottoms, right? So this might have been roughly the bottom, and then you still have economic deceleration, because basically what you start to do is then you price in more dovish central bank policy, more liquidity, things like that. So basically, the price bottom in such a volatile asset can precede the bottom of the actual economic situation. Doesn't mean it always has to work like that, but it's something to keep in mind. So I think the next 0 to 6 to 12 months is still very uncertain. Where you could chop along, you could rise
Yeah.
moderately, you could maybe see a lower low, but maybe not as explosive as we've already seen. And then I think that when you have a rising PMI environment, looking out, say in the next 6 to 24 months or 6 to 36 months, I think that's where I'd be more structurally bullish. So my highest conviction view is in that kind of multi-year time frame. But I think now is kind of a more interesting phase for watching it, maybe accumulating, while still being cautious and not being shocked if we do see, sideways
Yeah.
action or.
That's it for today, guys. If you found this video useful, then don't forget to like the video and share this knowledge with your friends and family. And don't forget to check out the full video, link is in the description. Thank you.